The last attribute that we're going to be looking at today is the immutability or the unchangeableness of God. And I think that out of all the attributes that we've been learning, this one perhaps comes off as either the most shocking or the most difficult to stomach. And if it isn't, I just think about it for a second. God calls us to pray to him and to intercede and to go and evangelize. And how could it be that God doesn't change his mind? What then is the purpose of prayer and evangelism? And this doctrine really causes us to scratch our heads for a little bit, and that's why I'm really excited to do our discussion together later. But until then, I just want to reassure you that this doctrine is pretty uncontroversial in the sense that it has to be true. If God is who he says he is, God's immutability needs to be a reality. And so, first and foremost, I just want to define this, and I think Grudem really does this well. He precisely helps us understand what we mean when we say that God is unchanging. And he says that God is unchanging in three respects. First, God is unchanging in his being. God, who he is, never changes. He is true. He does not grow. He does not devolve or evolve. He just remains the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So God is the same in his being. And number two, God is the same in his purposes. When God sets a purpose, when God sets a plan, when God makes a decision, it does not change. And so God is unchanging in his being and in his purposes. And lastly, God is unchanging in his promises for us. When God tells us something, when God gives us a promise to hold on to, it will surely come to pass. God is not fickle. God does not change his mind. And so these are three ways that God is unchanging. And, to help us see why God's immutability needs to be a reality, let me just ask you a question. Is God the most perfect being? We just went over God's infinity, how God is all perfect, he is all good, he is all knowing, he is all powerful. And, when you think about this as God's nature, wouldn't it be problematic that an all perfect being changes? If a perfect God changes, the only way he can change is become less perfect. But that's not possible for God. God is going to be perfect all the time. And not only that, when God works, he works out of his perfection, meaning he can't make mistakes. He can't do something that is not as good. And so he never has to go back and redo something. And so in that sense, God's purposes, the things that he sets, and the promises that he makes for us cannot change at all. And so that's what we mean when we say that God is immutable or unchangeable. And scripture over and over affirms this quite emphatically. When we look at Psalm 102, the psalmist meditates on the fact that God's character doesn't change. He says, "Of old you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you, O God, will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you, God, are the same, and your years have no end." And when we look at Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, particularly in God's way of dealing with us, this is what God says. He assures the Israelites. He says, "For I, the Lord, do not change. My purposes, my promises for you do not change. Therefore, you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." God made a promise to the children of Israel that God will save them, that God will be their deliverer. And as a result, no matter how much these Israelites sin against God, because God does not change, they can rest assured in his purpose and his promises to them. And so that concludes our last attribute, God's immutability. And I'm really excited, looking forward to our discussion time together as we flesh out the full implications of these doctrines as they play out in our daily lives. Okay, so see you soon.